Welcome to the ATA Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Baird, and you're listening to Inside Specialization, our new series on the what, why, and how of specializing in a specific field of translation or interpreting. In each episode, members of ATA's Professional Development Committee will interview translation and interpreting specialists. They'll ask about what the work entails, what skills are needed, the pros and cons, and so much more. The goal is to showcase the variety of career paths in translation and interpreting and help working professionals and students understand what's out there, how they can get started, and what they need to succeed. Specialization is arguably the best way to strengthen your translation and interpreting business and stand out from the crowd. We're hoping to bring you one episode a month, and we hope you'll join us on this informative journey. This podcast is brought to you by the American Translators Association. If you'd like to know more about ATA, we'll have some information at the end of the show. All right, now over to the PD Committee and this edition of Inside Specialization.
Hi, and welcome to Inside Specialization, an all-new feature of the ATA podcast on specialization and diversification. My name is Veronika Demichelis, and I am chair of ATA's Professional Development Committee. It is so exciting to bring this new series to life as a special collaboration between the ATA podcast and ATA's Professional Development Program. In this episode, we will talk about a fascinating, rewarding, and extremely important specialization, translating for the international development sector. And to talk to us about this field, I have with me today Meghan Konkol and Corinne McKay. Meghan Konkol is an independent ATA certified French to English translator specializing in international development, marketing and communications, and human resources. She holds a master's degree in French to English translation from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Prior to starting her freelance business, she worked in-house at a global language services provider as a project manager and French quality manager. She currently serves as a director on the ATA Board of Directors, chair of the ATA Membership Committee, and coordinator of the ATA School Outreach Program. Corinne McKay is an ATA certified French to English translator and a Colorado Court certified French interpreter based in Boulder, Colorado. She specializes in international development, corporate communication, and nonfiction book translation, and in court and legal interpreting. Her book, How to Succeed as a Freelance Translator, has become a go-to reference for the industry with over 12,000 copies in print, and she served as ATA president from 2017 through 2019. Welcome, Corinne and Meghan.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, so let's start with the basics. In your opinion, what skills do translators need to have, and is it something you're born with or something you can learn and develop?
Who wants to go first?
Yeah,
you go first, Meghan.
Yeah,
you go first, Meghan.
Sure. Well, I would say when it comes down to it, a translator is a writer, and they are curious people, and they care to know about what they're translating. So as I'm translating, there's all these other functions happening in my brain, like I need to research something more, or I'm considering the background story on why something is being translated, who's going to read it and why, who it might impact. So I think some of these are habits that you can be trained on with your decision making and research techniques. And over time, of course, your writing and your terminology will improve. But on the other hand, I think you really do need a solid foundation and genuine interest in what you're doing. And in that sense, that's less of a trainable thing because you can't really force yourself to like or care about something. So I think, there's a little bit of both in the answer to that question. What do you think, Corinne?
Yeah, I agree with Meghan. And I'd say one thing that's maybe a little bit different about international development translation is there are some people who work in this specialization who have significant work experience in the international development sector. So I definitely do, translate with translators who, let's say, they worked at the World Bank, or they were a Peace Corps volunteer, or like Meghan did study abroad in Senegal, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But I think as compared to other specializations, like let's say legal translation, it's more common that people have a sort of personal passion for the issues that you translate about in international development, and then they do further study on their own. So, like, one thing I often say to people who are interested in getting into legal translation is you're going to face a lot of competition from lawyers when you get to the high levels of legal translation, like a lot of, lawyer linguists. And I think in international development translation, I wouldn't say like the bar is lower. That's not the right way to put it. But I think it is not a specialization where you say, well, it's going to be like an uphill battle if you didn't work in that area for 20 years before you started translating about it.
Yeah, that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah, that's a good point for sure.
Yeah. So, how did the two of you get into translating about international development? Why don't you go first, Corinne?
Yeah, sure. So, like, I've been a freelancer for a long, long time. And so, the probably 15 years ago, just another translator who I work with here in Boulder worked for a translation agency in Switzerland that had a contract to do French to English translations for a big NGO there, and they needed more translators. And so she asked me if I was interested in applying, and that's how I got started. And then I just loved it. That I think before that, I had sort of struggled to find a specialization that really like clicked for me, where I thought like, this is both lucrative and meaningful. I mean, that sounds kind of terrible, but but I think, one of the like, and it's okay to have specializations that are just lucrative or just meaningful. That's totally fine. But I think I had sort of struggled to find a specialization that was like at the intersection of those things for me, and international development was really it. And then I scaled up from there, and then probably, and I still work for that client, by the way, but then probably, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years after that, my friend and colleague Yves Baudeux and I started marketing to direct clients in the international development sector. And again, I just find it something I've stuck with. And now that this year I'm doing a master's in conference interpreting, and I'd actually like to interpret for the types of clients that I translate for in international development. What about Megan's story is a lot more interesting than mine because it involves living in Senegal, not just getting a client offer out of the blue.
Well, yeah, I definitely have a click moment as Corinne describes as well. I think, a lot of translators, we do have an origin story with kind of a, when did the language really click for you as a real life thing? And, when did you actually see yourself as a translator? And so, yeah, I think absolutely that click moment for me was when I was an undergraduate student studying in Senegal. I was living in Dakar, and yeah, I just had an absolutely fantastic experience. I really saw firsthand real world applications of just living your life in a second language, meeting new people, forming new relationships that were all based in this other language. So that just had such a profound impact on me, and I just developed a real love for Senegal during my time there. So ever since coming back, I have always sought out ways to stay connected to Senegal, learn more about other French-speaking countries in Africa, and just do whatever I could to kind of keep that connection going. So once I started working as a translator, I, as a very newbie translator, when I had just graduated from my master's program and I was starting to take on work, I actually started volunteering as well. So I started doing volunteer translations for a nonprofit called Kiva. And in a nutshell, they're a website that facilitates crowdsourcing for microloans to entrepreneurs in developing countries. So that was a really good fit for my interest and a way to start actually seeing, what kind of translation work might be happening in that realm. And I still volunteer for Kiva today. So it's really been a great experience doing that. But of course, I did want to keep my eye out for actual paid work in the development sector. And I did actually from the beginning have a few projects here and there that were kind of mixed in with my other translation work, which was in marketing and corporate communications for the most part. And even in, when was this? In 2018, I actually had a chance to go back to Senegal, and I worked as a co-facilitator on a training workshop there. And that was really great to be able to go back. And around that time, I really started getting much more intentional about marketing and reaching out to clients working in this sector. So I would say up until then, it had kind of just happened haphazardly here and there. But after returning to Senegal and really thinking about it more, that really motivated me to seek out this work much more actively. So over time, I've just been able to bring on a few really great clients with super interesting work. And yeah, I'm still seeking out additional clients now, and I'm always finding new things that are really, really interesting. So yeah, it's been going very well.
Wow, yeah, that sounds wonderful. So, what are some typical translation assignments that both of you work on in this subject area, and who are your typical clients? Meghan, let's start with you this time.
Sure. So to really simplify it down, I would say two broad categories that I could put my work into would be reports and then general communications. So the reports are intended to give information and data to project stakeholders, and then the communications would be more focused on like promoting a program or a project for the public. So for the reports, I would say those are primarily focused on topics such as food security, agriculture, child labor, and education. So a report might explain what a certain issue is. So for example, something I've worked on is children are performing agricultural labor and not going to school. And so the report would go on to explain what is being done to address this issue and what the expected outcomes are, what progress has been made so far, and so on. So it can kind of just report back on everything that's been done and what is going to be done in the future. And then as for the communications work, again, that's more for the general public. So this could be on like a website or social media, and it would be overviews kind of promoting projects that a certain organization might be working on. And yeah, I would say for the most part, I work with, I guess it's a combination actually of NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, and other entities like research firms. And then there's also some work from translation agencies in this sector as well.
That's great. Yeah. What about you, Corinne?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really interesting about international development is it covers so many subspecializations. So Meghan and I actually teach a class together on international development translation, and I told the class this story that one of my clients said to me, "We have an agricultural document. Could we send it to you for translation?" And I said, "Sure. Well, let me take a look at it first." Fortunately. And it turned out it was the technical specifications for a robotic cow milking setup that they were thinking about purchasing for this like dairy farming promotion project in West Africa. And I mean, the kind of thing that you really need like a mechanical engineer,
Right.
to figure out like, is this going to work in the high temperatures that they often have in some of these sub-Saharan African regions? Do they have proper, cleaning setup? So one thing I think is really interesting is that whether you are interested in, more the medical angle, agricultural angle, women's issues, children's issues, food security, like there are so many subspecializations that it keeps it really interesting.
Yeah.
So I translate everything for, I translate for some big NGOs whose names everybody would recognize. And then I translate for my biggest clients actually are kind of under the radar NGOs who subcontract from big development entities like USAID, the US Agency for International Development. So for example, one of my clients does country reports on a specific sector in every country in sub-Saharan Africa, 23 of which are French speaking. So I translate all the country reports for those, and I've done that for about 3 years or so. And then Meghan and I actually work together through an agency on this food security project that's really interesting that looks at factors that predict upcoming food shortages or famines. So for example, like what's the price of a goat in a typical, market in rural Mauritania and things like that. So I just think it's a really fascinating area in that there are so many subspecializations that you can kind of gravitate toward things that, areas that you enjoy. And like Meghan, my clients pretty much span the map. I'd say a minority are agencies, but there's some agency work, particularly for entities like in the UN system. They have so much translation work that they sometimes use translation agencies. And then I translate directly for NGOs that, that the kind of places that you hear like fundraising on NPR and things like that, or for NGOs who no one would ever recognize because they're mostly subcontractors to entities like USAID.
Wow, yeah, it sounds like such a rewarding field to work in. I
It
used
is.
to
And I'm
work in,
sure there's work for
yeah,
Russian
yeah,
here,
that's what I'm
Veronica.
thinking. I mean, I worked in corporate social responsibility for many years before I
Oh my
became a
gosh,
freelance
you should have been
translator.
doing
So,
this yesterday.
yeah,
Yeah.
I can recognize the need for that, and it
Hmm.
really falls in with the whole topic of sustainable development and so many
Right.
other things. So, you kind of mentioned some issues before, not issues. So you mentioned some things that make it rewarding for you and interesting for you to work in this field. But if you could sum up, what do you like best about translating for international development projects? Let's start with you, Corinne.
I mean, I think to me, like I said at the start, that if you find the sort of sweet spot clients, it is both a, very viable business model and it's very meaningful. So I think many times, and I love pretty much every aspect of translation, but I think many times when you do sort of general commercial translation, or, like I used to do mostly legal translation when I first started out, and we often have the feeling that a lot of our stuff is being translated just because it has to be translated. I mean,
Right.
like as an example, Megan, I don't know whether we were there together, but one year I did a presentation at the ATA conference about international development translation, and there were maybe 150 people in the room. And I said, raise your hand if you either suspect or know for sure that you did a translation that no one but you ever read. And like 147 people raised their hand.
Right. Right.
And and to me, I think international development is the opposite of that. Like you're translating a survey that is actually going to be either administered to people, or for us going into English, it would be so the English speakers can know the results of the survey. Or like one
Exactly.
of my NGO clients won a big humanitarian award a few years ago. And I thought, certainly it wasn't the quality of the French to English translation that got them there, but I played some small role in the fact that they are recognized as doing, outstanding humanitarian work in the world. So, I mean, there's lots of things I like about it. What about you, Megan?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a lot of the same reasons why I would say I like it so much. And yeah, kind of your last point about even though yeah, I consider myself like a small piece in the overall accomplishments that are being done, but even just being that small piece is so important. And help, if there's any way I can support missions that I believe in through my specific skills and kind of pass that along in the line of what needs to get done to achieve this end goal. If I can contribute my expertise and be involved in that, that is super rewarding to me. And I think, yeah, that other sense of knowing that, knowing what it's going to be used for, and that the translation will be used, and it's really helping somebody. I love that feeling. And yeah, I think working on this kind of translation is a reminder that even though we may be translating about a project that's happening quite far away, we all are human and we're all in this together, in this, on Earth. So I do like that component of it quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like not to get all emotional, but I think to me, like the positive part of international development translation, and I know we're going to talk about challenges too, it really like goes to the heart of why all of us do this job,
Hmm.
which is to help people who speak different languages or
Right.
belong to different cultures understand each other.
Yeah.
So, like a couple of
Exactly.
years ago, I translated for a family planning research project where they're trying to figure out I think it was in Burkina Faso, like child mortality rates have dropped precipitously due to better public health programs, but the average woman still has more than 6 children. So, the idea being like, the population growth will drop when child mortality drops because people will have fewer children because they believe that their children will live past infancy, but that doesn't seem to be true. Why is that? And I think like that goes to the heart of why all of us do this job, which is like intercultural understanding. That's my
Yeah.
little like emotional riff.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. So, on the flip side, are there any challenges in working with this specialization?
Well, I would say it's not typically the kind of work that will just land in your inbox if you're not specifically looking for it. So if you do want to specialize in this, you do have to be, I would say most people do have to be quite intentional about finding their work, and who do they want to work with and what projects do they want to support. Because as a lot of translators who may fall into the cycle of just kind of translating what lands in your inbox, I wouldn't say a specialization in international development can be built very easily that way. I would also say it does require, as with any specialization, it does require background knowledge and research. So especially if you haven't traveled to the source language country or countries, or if you hadn't had any other significant exposure to the cultures and the concepts, those could present some challenges, but you are able to, you can put in the work and the time to overcome those. You just have to make sure that you actually do that.
Yeah, and I think just to add to what Meghan said, one thing that you're going to encounter, which I think is both an interesting aspect and a challenge, is that if you are someone like myself, to be honest, who has traveled quite a bit, but only ever really lived in, industrialized Northern Hemisphere countries, you're going to encounter quite a lot of stuff where like you understand the words easily enough. The concept is something you've never encountered. And here's where I actually think people like Meghan have a big advantage. Anybody who did study abroad in West Africa instead of in France like I did, you should become an international development translator. Because, for example, you translate about things like fighting the public perception that malaria is caused by witchcraft. I translated a whole thing about that.
Yeah.
I translated a whole thing about, so I was translating, it was that family planning project I was talking about, and they were talking about hospitals that have placenta pits. And I thought, gosh, I had a baby in a hospital in America, and I don't know what a placenta pit is. And, it turns out it's because they don't have powerful enough medical waste incinerators to incinerate something like a placenta, so they bury them, which, comes with its own set of challenges. And I just think like being honest about your perspective as a, industrialized Westerner or Northerner, however you want to put it, that you're going to come across concepts that are just culturally completely foreign to you, not in the linguistic sense, but in terms of like ideas you've never encountered.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Yep.
Wow, these are really important perspectives to keep in mind. So, to those of our listeners who are getting really interested and excited about this field now, let's see if you can share some advice. So, what advice would you give a working translator who is interested in diversifying or specializing in international development? Corinne, what about you?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, the work is going to be not exclusively direct clients, but probably primarily. So make sure that you're ready for that in terms of confidence in your translation skills and at least one person who you can work with in case you need to split large projects or you need an editor. And then I'd say think about what subspecializations you might be interested in. Because on one end of the spectrum, you have the like robotic cow milking setup and on the other end of the spectrum, you have, things that are completely non-technical. So, I honestly do think that it's an interesting specialization for people who like technical translation with sort of a human component, because there honestly is a lot of technical stuff, like water system engineering. And I mean, I don't
Right.
do technical translation at all, but I think that it actually could be really interesting for, translators in that area. And then there are tons of free online courses through outfits like Coursera about the international development sector. So, for example, one of the core concepts is the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a set, is it 12 or 13, Megan? You know that?
It's 17.
17.
So,
Yeah.
Megan's like my backup brain. It's a set of 17 goals set forth by the United Nations that are sort of on the core objectives of international development. You could take a class about that, or you could pick one
mhm.
of those that you want to focus on and then look for NGOs um, that specialize in those. And you can look in your source or target countries. I have a lot of clients in the US and a lot of clients in France and Switzerland. It's kind of both.
Right. Yep. I agree. And I'm glad that Corinne brought up the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. In the class that Corinne and I teach that she mentioned earlier, that's kind of the starting point that I suggest as, if you don't already have a topic narrowed down within the wide umbrella of international development, take a look at the Sustainable Development Goals list, because there's so much in there, and they're not all separate, they do overlap, but I think if you're feeling a little bit unsure about where to go within this category, that list of goals can really help you identify what you think is important, what you might already know some about, and kind of what next steps you can take. And some of them will align very clearly with, if you're following developments in a specific country or region, you'll be able to identify which of these goals you think are going to be closely related to the area that you want to do work in. So as I mentioned before, if you haven't already had that exposure to the culture and what's going on in a specific geographic area, you'll need to put in the homework to get yourself up to speed. But otherwise, I really do think that narrowing it down to something that to a more specific topic is a really good first step.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, finally, what advice would you give to a student who is studying language or translation and is now thinking, oh, that sounds like a great field? What if they are interested in translating for international development projects in the future? What would you recommend?
Well, if you are currently a student, my number one tip is to study abroad. I can't recommend it highly enough. If that's not an option, you can be mindful of what you are exposing yourself to. So the culture that you choose to, like literature, art, music, movies, anything that you want to consume, why not take a look at immersing yourself in that source country to learn more about really anything you could possibly find. You can also look for volunteer opportunities, like what I do with Kiva has been a really great opportunity. Some people after college might be interested in doing Peace Corps. If you have that opportunity, that would be a fantastic way to travel to a country that would, establish a connection for you there. Those would be my biggest tips for anyone who is a student.
Yeah, I'd say do all of those. And I just think it's a sector where there is a bottomless need for pro bono translations. So, one of the things that Megan and I talk about a lot is like people think that there's no money to be made in translating for the international development sector. And actually, I think the opposite. Like some of my NGO clients are actually some of my higher paying direct clients. But if you look at, small NGOs that are just a couple of people who have this passion project in, Haiti, West Africa, Megan and I think about French speaking countries, but there's all of Latin America. Even Russian speaking countries, I'm sure, Veronica,
Yeah.
that there are lots and lots and lots of NGOs that I think would love to have volunteer translators, whereas I think if you're trying to get into, patent translation, there just isn't that much of a demand for like volunteer patent translators.
Right.
That I think that in a way, it's like a comparatively easy sector to get experience in, because you just, approach some NGOs that work with your languages and ask if they could use, some pro bono language skills, and I'm sure they could.
Wow, yeah, thank you. That's amazing. It really, it's really inspiring to hear all these
Don't you want to
examples.
do it now, Veronica?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Corinne and Meghan. It's been really interesting to hear about how you got into this field and what your work entails. And I hope that this inspires our listeners and gives them ideas. And hopefully some of them will put your great tips to use. So thank you so much, Meghan and Corinne.
Great.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
You've been listening to Inside Specialization, our new series on the what, why, and how of specializing in a specific field of translation or interpreting. Big thanks to everyone involved in the production of this episode. ATA's PD committee developed and coordinated the interview. Mixing and editing was done by Derek Platz. Mary David and Rashawn Paccarel at ATA headquarters provided editorial and technical support. Now, if you learned anything new in today's podcast, I bet there's somebody out there who would like to know it too. Don't be stingy. Tell them about us. I've gotten to know so many great podcasts that way. I promise they'll thank you for it. And if you're not an ATA member, listen up. I've been a member for over 20 years. I can honestly say that ATA launched my freelance career, and I've never looked back. Nowadays, the demand for translators and interpreters is at an all-time high, but finding quality work isn't easy. ATA membership can make a difference. And ATA isn't just for translators or interpreters. Individuals, companies, and organizations can become members. We have teachers, professors, hospital administrators, language company owners, technology developers, as well as language companies, universities, hospitals, and government agencies. Go to ATA's website, atanet.org, for details. Or check out past episodes of this podcast where we talk about the benefits of membership and what's currently happening in the association. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Talk to you again soon.